How a tiny Viking tribe built the world's oldest kingdom. Close your eyes for a moment and picture Denmark. You probably see bicycles, Hygge, Lego bricks scattered on a living room floor, pastries in a warm bakery window. The United Nations consistently ranking this small Scandinavian nation as one of the happiest countries on earth. A land of windmills and welfare states, of universal health care and beautiful design, of a people so contented that psychologists travel there to study them like a rare and precious species. Now, erase that image entirely, because 1,000 years ago, the mention of Denmark, the mere whisper that Danish ships had been spotted on the horizon, did not produce thoughts of cozy cafés. It produced screaming. It produced people abandoning their homes and running inland as fast as their legs would carry them. It produced monks in coastal monasteries hurriedly burying their gold and praying to a god who, in this moment, did not seem to be listening. It produced the specific terror that comes from knowing that what is coming toward you is not merely an army, but a force of nature wearing human skin. The Vikings of Denmark were the most feared maritime raiders in the history of the medieval world. They sacked Paris, they burned Dublin, they colonized Iceland, Greenland, and reached North America 5 centuries before Columbus. Under their greatest king, they controlled England, Norway, and parts of Sweden simultaneously. An empire that stretched across the North Sea and briefly made a Danish king the most powerful ruler in Northern Europe. And then, somehow, through a process that is one of the most fascinating stories in all of European history, those same seafaring warriors transformed themselves into the architects of the world's oldest continuous monarchy. A kingdom that has survived without interruption for more than 1,000 years, that has outlasted the Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and every other political entity that has risen and fallen around it. But to understand the soul of Denmark, we have to look past the Viking longships and the medieval crowns. We have to go back to a time when this land was nothing more than a collection of scattered islands and marshy peninsulas gripped by the remnants of the Great Ice Age. 7,000 years ago, the people of this land weren't kings. They were survivors. They lived in a world of bog and bone. They left behind mysterious sacrifices, jewelry, weapons, and bodies, preserved so perfectly by the peat bogs that today we can still see the fingerprints and the final expressions of people who lived before the pyramids of Egypt were even a dream. These Bog People tell us a story of a culture that was deeply spiritual, intensely connected to the earth, and already developing the social cohesion that defines the Danes today. As the Bronze Age dawned, Denmark became a literal sun kingdom. These early Danes were fascinated by the celestial bodies, crafting the famous Sun Chariot, a masterpiece of bronze and gold that proves they were already master craftsmen and traders, connected to networks stretching all the way to the Mediterranean. But the peace of the Sun Kingdom wouldn't last. And as the Roman Empire expanded to the south, the tribes of Jutland, the Cimbri, and the Teutons found themselves at a crossroads. They didn't just watch Rome, they challenged it. In a massive migration that shook the Roman Senate to its core, these barbarians from the north proved that the people of the Danish peninsula were not to be ignored. They were the ancestors of the warriors who would one day change the map of the world. This is where our journey truly begins, at the collision of ancient ritual and the rising tide of an empire. How does a band of Iron Age warriors become the world's happiest people? How does a kingdom built on blood and salt water and sheer violent ambition survive 1,000 years of European history intact? That is the story of Denmark. And it begins not with the Vikings, but with something older and stranger and considerably more disturbing. The peninsula of Jutland juts northward from the European continent like a fist raised at the sky. It is a land shaped by contradiction, harsh and beautiful, flat and dramatic, endlessly assaulted by the sea on three sides, its interior a mosaic of heath and forest and the dark, still waters of the peat bogs. Those bogs have been keeping secrets for 2,000 years. In 1950, two brothers were cutting peat near the village of Tolland in central Jutland when their tools struck something unexpected. Not peat, not root, something softer and more wrong. They stopped digging and looked closer, and what they found was a face, so perfectly preserved by the extraordinary chemistry of the bog that the brothers immediately assumed they had found a recent murder victim and called the police. They had not found a recent murder victim. They had found a man who had been placed in that bog approximately 2,400 years ago, around 400 BC, during the period we call the pre-Roman Iron Age. The Tolland man, as he came to be called, was so perfectly preserved that his stubble was still visible on his chin, the wrinkles of his forehead still legible, the expression on his face, eyes closed, lips slightly parted, almost peaceful, still fully readable after 2.5 millennia in the dark. He had been killed. The leather cord used to hang him was still knotted around his neck. His last meal, a porridge of barley, linseed, and various wild plants, was still analyzable in his stomach. And then he had been placed, with what appears to be deliberate care, in the black water of the bog that would preserve him. Tolland man is not a curiosity. He is a window. He represents the people who inhabited the land that would one day become Denmark, long before there were any Danes, the Iron Age tribes of Jutland and the Danish islands, who left no written records, but left their dead in the bogs in numbers that still astonish archaeologists. More than 500 preserved bog bodies have been found in Denmark alone. Many show evidence of violent death. Many appear to have been placed rather than simply disposed of, arranged with a care that suggests ritual significance. The people who created Tolland man were not yet the Vikings. They were not yet Danes. They were, only in the terminology of classical antiquity, various Germanic and Celtic tribal groups who occupied the northern European peninsula, and they lived by a combination of farming, fishing, and the kind of hard-scrabble survival that a northern European climate demands. But among these tribes were two that the Roman world encountered with consequences it never forgot. The Cimbri and the Teutones, both believed to have originated from Jutland or the surrounding regions, migrated southward in the late 2nd century BC in a mass movement that represented one of the greatest military crises Rome had faced since Hannibal crossed the Alps. Between 113 BC and 101 BC, the Cimbri and Teutones carved a path of destruction across Roman territory that included the annihilation of multiple Roman armies and the deaths of tens of thousands of Roman soldiers and a genuine existential crisis for the Republic. At the Battle of Arausio in 105 BC, they destroyed a combined Roman force estimated at somewhere between 80,000 and 120,000 men. A defeat so catastrophic that it compared to Cannae, the darkest day in Roman military history. Rome panicked. The historian Plutarch describes Roman mothers killing their own children rather than let them fall into the hands of the northern invaders. The Cimbri were eventually defeated by the Roman general Gaius Marius, who reorganized the Roman army specifically to fight them. But their emergence from the peninsula of Jutland established a pattern that would define northern European history for the next 12 centuries. When the people of Denmark moved, the rest of the world paid attention. Back in Jutland itself, the Iron Age world that the bog bodies inhabited was organized around small agricultural communities, tribal kinship networks, and a relationship with the natural world that produced both extraordinary art, the period's metalwork, recovered from burial sites across Denmark, is of astonishing sophistication, and the ritualized violence of the bog sacrifices. What were the bog bodies for? The honest answer is that we do not know with certainty, but the most compelling theories suggest that they were offerings to the water, to the gods who lived there, to whatever forces the Iron Age mind of Jutland believed animated the dark world beneath the peat. Some may have been criminals executed according to the community's laws. Some may have been willing sacrifices. Some may have been chosen for reasons we cannot now reconstruct. What we can say is that the people of Iron Age Jutland possessed a worldview in which human life was connected to the landscape in ways that modern secular culture has largely lost. A world where the bog was alive, where the darkness under the water was inhabited by powers that required appeasement, and where the appropriate response to an uncertain harvest or a threatened community might be to give the dark water what it wanted. These are the people from whom the Danes descend. Not mythologically, the ethnic continuity across 2,000 years is complicated and partial, but culturally and geographically. The land of bog bodies and cold seas and hard winters is the same land that would produce the Vikings. The capacity for violence and the relationship with water are ancient inheritances, and slowly, over the 5 centuries between the end of the Roman Iron Age and the emergence of the Viking Age, the tribal societies of Jutland and the Danish islands began to consolidate. Trade networks expanded. Small kingdoms formed around successful warrior chiefs. The sea routes connecting the Danish islands to the Norwegian coast, to the Baltic, to England and France, were being mapped and traveled with increasing confidence. By the 8th century A.D., the pieces that would become Denmark were assembling themselves. All they needed was a spark. That spark came from the sea. June 8th, 793 A.D., the monastery of Lindisfarne on a small island off the northeast coast of England. The monks of this sacred community had built one of the greatest centers of Christian learning in the British Isles. Their illuminated manuscripts, including the Lindisfarne Gospels, were among the most precious cultural objects in the Christian world. The monastery was remote, yes, but remoteness had always been protection. No one raided monasteries. The church was inviolable. And then the ships came. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes what happened next, with a brevity that is more horrifying than any elaboration. In this year, terrible portents appeared over Northumbria and miserably frightened the inhabitants. There were exceptional flashes of lightning, and fiery dragons were seen flying through the air. A great famine followed hard upon these signs, and a little after that, in the same year, on the 8th of June, the ravaging of heathen men miserably destroyed God's church in Lindisfarne through plunder and slaughter. The Vikings had arrived, and they had arrived as a statement. The word Viking is itself contested. It may derive from the Old Norse Vik, meaning bay or inlet, suggesting people who came from the fjords, or from the verb vikja, meaning to move quickly, to veer away. But whatever the etymology, the phenomenon it describes was specific, organized, and terrifyingly effective. Maritime raids launched from Scandinavia, primarily from Denmark and Norway, targeting the coastal communities of Western Europe for their wealth and their slaves. Why did the Viking Age begin when it did? The causes are multiple and still debated by historians. But the leading theories point to a combination of factors that all converge in the late 8th century. Population pressure in Scandinavia, more people than the agricultural land could support. The development of a specific ship technology, the Viking longship, that was simultaneously the fastest, most maneuverable, and most seaworthy vessel in the medieval world. The weakness of the Frankish Empire under Charlemagne's successors, which left the coastal regions of France, Britain, and the Low Countries less defended than they had been, and the specific social structure of Scandinavian society, which produced large numbers of younger sons who would not inherit land and who had every incentive to seek fortune elsewhere. The longship deserves a moment of genuine appreciation because it is one of the great technological achievements of the medieval world. Built from overlapping planks of oak using the clinker construction technique, the longship combined shallow draft. It could navigate rivers that other vessels could not enter with remarkable seaworthiness in open ocean. It could be rowed or sailed. It could be carried overland between rivers by its crew. It required no deep-water harbor. It could land directly on a beach, deploy its warriors, and depart before any organized defense could be mounted. It was the medieval equivalent of the helicopter gunship, fast, flexible, and impossible to defend against with the conventional military thinking of the time. For the first century of the Viking Age, the Danes operated primarily as raiders, exploiting the wealth of the British Isles and the Frankish coast with seasonal campaigns that followed a brutal but effective rhythm. Sail in spring, raid through summer, return home with slaves and silver before the autumn storms. But the Danes were not simply pirates. They were also traders, colonizers, and geopolitical actors of the First Order. The Danelaw, the substantial portion of England that came under Danish control during the 9th century, encompassing roughly the eastern half of the country, from Yorkshire to East Anglia, was not just a raiding zone. It was a settlement. Danish farmers, craftsmen, and merchants established communities that left permanent marks on English place names, English law, and the English language itself. More than 1,000 English place names end in by, farm or settlement, thorp, village, or thwaite, meadow, all Old Norse. The word sky is Old Norse. So are knife, egg, window, husband, and cake. The English language absorbed a significant Danish component during the Viking Age that has never been fully extracted. In the east, Danish and Swedish Vikings penetrated the rivers of Eastern Europe, the Volga, the Dnieper, reaching Constantinople and establishing the trade routes that would eventually produce Russia. The word Russia itself may derive from the Old Norse Russ, the name given to the Scandinavian traders who operated these eastern routes. And in the west, Norwegian Vikings, closely related to and frequently allied with the Danes, reached Iceland in the 870s, Greenland around 985, and the coast of North America, which they called Vinland, around 1000 A.D. The Norse settlement at L'Anse-aux-Meadows in Newfoundland, excavated and confirmed by archaeology in the 1960s, predates Columbus by 5 centuries. But here is the question that transforms the Viking story from simple brutality into something more complex and more interesting. How did a society of raiders become a kingdom? The answer involves a man named Gorm, a runestone, a dentist's discovery, and the most unlikely branding exercise in medieval history. Gorm the Old is one of the most frustrating figures in Danish history precisely because we know so little about him. He is generally credited as the first king of Denmark in the line of a continuous monarchy, the founding ancestor of the royal house that still sits on the Danish throne today. But the historical record is thin. We know he ruled from Jelling in Jutland, the site of 2 enormous burial mounds that dominate the flat landscape. We know he had a wife named Thyra, who was clearly important. Contemporary sources describe her as Denmark's adornment. We know he died in the middle of the 10th century, and we know he had a son named Harald, who would prove to be one of the most consequential rulers in Danish history. That son was Harald Bluetooth. Stop for a moment because we need to address the obvious question before we continue. Yes. Your phone's Bluetooth wireless technology is named after a 10th century Viking king, and it is not just a clever marketing choice. The connection is genuinely meaningful, and understanding it reveals something important about what Harald Bluetooth actually accomplished. In the late 950s or early 960s, Harald unified the various Jutish and Danish island petty kingdoms under his direct rule. This was significant, but not unique. His father Gorm had begun this process. What made Harald different was what he did next. He converted to Christianity, and then he built the most remarkable advertising campaign the medieval world had ever seen. At Jelling, the site of his father's great burial mounds, Harald erected 2 rune stones. The larger of them, now known as the Jelling Stone, or, less officially, the birth certificate of Denmark, bears an inscription in runic script that reads, translated, Harald, king, commanded these memorials to be made after Gorm, his father, and Thyra, his mother, the Harald who conquered all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christians, conquered all of Denmark and Norway, made the Danes Christians. These are not small claims. Harald was doing something that no northern European ruler had attempted so explicitly before. He was defining his kingdom by its borders, its people, and its religion, and he was putting that definition on a stone monument designed to last forever. The Bluetooth wireless technology was named after Harald specifically because of what he did, connecting previously disconnected things. The technology's developers, working in the 1990s, chose the name as a metaphor for their protocol's ability to unite different devices and standards, just as Harald had united different tribes and kingdoms. The Bluetooth logo is even a combination of Harald's initials in runic script, the H rune and the B rune merged together. So next time your wireless earbuds connect to your phone, you are, in some small but genuine way, commemorating a 10th century Viking king who decided that Denmark needed both a god and a press release. Harald's conversion to Christianity was not simply a personal spiritual experience, it was a diplomatic masterstroke. By the 960s, the Christian Holy Roman Empire, led by the German king Otto I, represented the dominant political and cultural force in Central Europe. A pagan Scandinavian kingdom was, in the political vocabulary of the time, a legitimate target for Christian crusade and forced conversion, as the Saxons had discovered when Charlemagne forcibly baptized them at sword point. By converting voluntarily and conspicuously, Harald made Denmark a member of the Christian International Order. He received the diplomatic recognition that came with that membership. He established relationships with the major European powers that would protect Denmark from the kind of civilizational war that had devastated other northern peoples who refused conversion. He also, not incidentally, got a tremendous amount done in the way of state building. Harald constructed the Trelleborg ring fortresses, 4 perfectly circular military installations of extraordinary geometric precision, built to the same design in different parts of Denmark. The engineering required to build these fortresses to such exact specifications suggests a level of centralized administrative control that is remarkable for a 10th century kingdom. These were not the improvised camps of a chieftain. They were the military infrastructure of a state. And Harald built the Ravning Bridge across the Vejle River at 760 meters, the longest Viking Age bridge in Scandinavia. A bridge of that scale requires labor organization, materials procurement, engineering knowledge, and political authority across a substantial territory. It is the physical evidence of a functioning kingdom. Harald Bluetooth died around 986, probably killed in a rebellion led by his own son, Sven Forkbeard. But he left behind him something far more durable than his own life: the first clearly defined, internationally recognized Kingdom of Denmark. The year is 1016. The city of London is under siege. The English king, Edmund Ironside, has just died, possibly from natural causes, possibly from the knife of an assassin. The historical record is unhelpfully ambiguous on this point. And the man who receives the news of Edmund's death is a young Danish king, 21 or 22 years old, whose name in Danish was Knud, whose name the English would write as Cnut or Cnut, and who would become, within a decade, the master of the most powerful empire in northern Europe. How did Denmark get to this point? The story runs through Harald's usurping son, Sven Forkbeard, a man who fully earned his magnificent nickname and who was one of the most effective military commanders of the early medieval period. Sven began raiding England systematically in the 990s, extracting the enormous sums of silver called Danegeld that the increasingly desperate English king Ethelred the Unready paid to make the Danes go away. Danegeld was not a solution. It was a business model. The Danes took the silver, went home, and came back for more. In 1013, Sven Forkbeard launched a full-scale conquest of England, not a raid, but an invasion intended to produce a regime change. He succeeded so thoroughly and so quickly that Ethelred fled to Normandy, and Sven was briefly King of England, the first Danish ruler of the English kingdom. He died 5 weeks later, leaving his son Cnut to complete the conquest. Cnut the Great is one of the most underrated figures in European history. He is best known today for the legend, almost certainly invented and certainly misunderstood, of commanding the tide to stop and failing. The story, as usually told, is offered as evidence of royal hubris, but the medieval sources that record it present it very differently, as a demonstration of humility. Cnut commanding the tide specifically to show his flattering courtiers that no earthly king could command nature and that only God possessed such power. The real Cnut was a figure of extraordinary political sophistication who transformed what began as a Viking conquest into something unprecedented. By 1028, Cnut controlled England, Denmark, Norway, and part of Sweden. He had created what modern historians sometimes call the North Sea Empire, a maritime dominion that made the North Sea a Danish lake and gave its ruler a degree of control over northern European trade and politics unmatched before or since. But here is what is remarkable about Cnut's England. He did not rule it as a conqueror. He ruled it as an English king. He kept English administrative structures largely intact. He kept English laws. He patronized English monasteries and the English church. He married Emma of Normandy, Ethelred's widow, thereby linking himself to both the English and Norman aristocracies. He governed through English earls as much as through Danish commanders. A letter Cnut sent to the English people in 1020, one of the remarkable surviving documents of the period, reads not as the communique of a conqueror, but as the promise of a reforming king. He would maintain just laws, protect the church, punish wrongdoers, and be worthy of the loyalty his subjects showed him. It is almost Churchillian in its combination of authority and reassurance. Cnut also understood the international prestige game with a sophistication that would have impressed any modern public relations consultant. In 1027, he traveled to Rome to attend the coronation of the Holy Roman Emperor Conrad II. He was the only Northern European king at that coronation. He negotiated with the Pope and with Conrad directly, securing for Danish merchants reduced tolls throughout the empire's trade routes and establishing Denmark as a respected member of the Christian international community. He came home and wrote a letter about it, sent to his subjects in England. That is one of the most extraordinary pieces of medieval political communication. He described his negotiations, the respect he had been shown, the agreements he had secured, and then made the political argument explicit that Denmark's standing in Europe was a benefit to every Danish and English subject, meant that a king who commanded respect on the world stage served his people better than one who was merely locally powerful. This was statecraft of the highest order, and it came from a man whose father had been burning English villages 20 years earlier. At the height of Cnut's empire, a traveler could sail from London to Bergen to Roskilde, the Danish royal capital, under the protection of a single crown. The North Sea was not a barrier between kingdoms, but the highway of an empire. Danish merchants, Danish administrators, and Danish law connected communities from the English Midlands to the Norwegian fjords. For one generation, Denmark was not a small Scandinavian kingdom. It was the center of the world. And then Cnut died. He was 39 or 40 years old in 1035. And he left behind exactly the problem that every medieval empire built on personal power eventually faces, the problem of succession. His North Sea empire did not survive him by much. England passed to his son Harald Harefoot, then to his other son Harthacnut, neither of whom possessed his father's combination of military strength, political intelligence, and sheer personal authority. When Harthacnut died childless in 1042, the English nobility invited Edward the Confessor, the son of the English King Ethelred, to take the English throne. The Danish line in England was over. Norway reasserted its independence. Sweden had never been fully incorporated. By 1042, Denmark was back to being Denmark, the dominant Scandinavian power, certainly, and a kingdom of real consequence in European politics, but no longer an empire. Denmark was at its peak. It owned the seas. It had placed a Danish king on the throne of the most powerful Christian kingdom in northern Europe. But empires built on blood are rarely stable, and the medieval era was about to bring the Danes to their knees. The centuries that followed the collapse of Cnut's empire were not kind to Denmark. They were the centuries in which the kingdom learned something that every long-lasting state eventually learns, that survival requires adaptation, and that the ability to reinvent oneself under pressure is more important than any particular configuration of power. The 12th and 13th centuries saw Denmark attempt its own version of imperial expansion, not across the North Sea this time, but eastward and southward into the Baltic world. King Valdemar I, who came to the throne in 1157 after a devastating period of civil war, and his successors, particularly Valdemar II, who reigned from 1202 to 1241, built a Danish Baltic Empire that at its height controlled much of the southern Baltic coast, parts of modern Estonia, still called Denmark's land. Eesti in Estonian has no connection to this, but the name Tallinn, the Estonian capital, does derive from Danish, Tani Linn, meaning Danish town, and dominated Baltic trade. This was a different kind of Danish power from the Viking Age, more territorial, more ecclesiastical, more embedded in the feudal structures of medieval Christendom. Denmark participated in the Baltic Crusades, the church-sanctioned military campaigns that brought Christianity, at sword point as usual, to the pagan peoples of the eastern Baltic coast. Archbishop Absalon of Roskilde, the warrior bishop who was simultaneously the greatest churchman and the greatest military commander of 12th century Denmark, epitomizes this fusion. A man who built churches and burned fleets with equal dedication, who founded the city of Copenhagen, then called Haven, the harbor, as a military strongpoint against Baltic pirates, and who remains one of the towering figures of Danish medieval history. But the Baltic Empire was not stable either. The Battle of Bornhoved in 1227 was a catastrophic defeat, at the hands of a coalition of North German princes, a battle in which Denmark lost most of its southern Baltic possessions in a single afternoon, and from which Valdemar II spent the rest of his reign trying unsuccessfully to recover. The lesson of Bornhoved is the lesson that medieval Denmark kept having to relearn, that a small kingdom cannot sustain imperial overreach indefinitely, that the costs of maintaining far-flung possessions eventually exceed the revenues they produce, and that the neighbors you have been raiding or taxing or conquering tend, given the opportunity, to push back. The 14th century brought Denmark a catastrophe that required no military defeat to deliver. The Black Death arrived in Scandinavia in 1350, carried on ships from England and the Low Countries, and killed approximately one-third of the Danish population in 2 years. One-third, in a kingdom of perhaps 600,000 to 800,000 people. That is somewhere between 200,000 and 260,000 dead in approximately 2 years from a cause that no one understood, against which there was no defense, and from which there was no appeal. The social consequences of the plague were enormous. Labor was suddenly scarce. The surviving peasants found themselves for the first time in a position of genuine bargaining power. The Church, which had failed conspicuously to protect its flock from divine punishment and had lost a catastrophic proportion of its clergy, suffered a crisis of authority from which it would not fully recover. The great landowners found that the feudal relationships they had maintained through the combination of custom and coercion were harder to maintain when the people doing the customary labor were dead. Denmark's response to the plague years and the instability that followed was, characteristically, political. The kingdom was always, at its most creative, a political organism rather than a military one, and it is in this period that we see the emergence of the institutions that would eventually distinguish Danish governance. The Danehof, the great assembly of Danish nobles, clergy, and later the towns, had existed in various forms since the early medieval period, but it was in the 14th century that it began to develop the constitutional significance that would shape Danish political culture for centuries. It was the Danehof that formalized the principle that the Danish monarch ruled with the consent of the most powerful elements of Danish society, a principle that is the ancestor of the constitutional arrangements that govern Denmark today. This is not a trivial point. The Viking Age had produced strong kings who ruled through personal authority and military prowess. For the medieval period, through the crises of plague and warfare and succession dispute, produced a more institutional model of kingship, one in which the king's power was real, but was exercised within a framework of customary and increasingly written law. Denmark was learning to be a state, rather than simply a realm. In June 1397, in the Swedish city of Kalmar, just across the water from the Danish island of Bornholm, something extraordinary happened. Representatives of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway signed a document of union that created a single political entity encompassing all three kingdoms, the Kalmar Union. The woman behind this achievement was one of the most remarkable rulers in medieval European history, Queen Margaret I of Denmark, a woman who had become the de facto ruler of Denmark at the age of 25 after the death of her husband and the minority of her son, who had then secured the Norwegian throne, and who had then, by a combination of military force and political brilliance, driven the Swedish king from his throne and established herself as the effective ruler of all three Scandinavian kingdoms. Margaret could not be formally crowned queen in her own right. Medieval convention required a male monarch. So her young great-nephew, Eric of Pomerania, was crowned king of the three realms at Kalmar, and Margaret ruled through him as regent. The Kalmar Union was her creation, and she governed it with extraordinary skill until her death in 1412. The Kalmar Union, at its height, was genuinely formidable. It controlled the entire Scandinavian peninsula, the Atlantic islands from the Faroe Islands to Iceland to Greenland, and enormous stretches of the Baltic coast. Its combined population was substantial by the standards of Northern Europe. Its control of the Sound, the narrow strait between Denmark and Sweden through which all Baltic trade had to pass, gave it a stranglehold on the commerce of Northern Europe. The Sound toll is one of the most important and least known economic institutions in European history. For more than 3 centuries, from the early 15th century until 1857, Danish kings charged a toll on every ship that passed through the Øresund, the strait between the Danish island of Zealand and the Swedish province of Scania, which was Danish territory until the 17th century. At its peak, this toll collected on approximately 5,000 to 10,000 ships per year. The Sound Toll archives, kept in Copenhagen, are one of the most extraordinary commercial records in the world. Tens of thousands of entries documenting the cargoes, origins, destinations, and duties paid by every ship that used the strait from 1574 to 1857. They are the most comprehensive trade data set for any European waterway in the early modern period, and economic historians have used them to reconstruct the entire structure of Northern European commerce across 3 centuries. What the toll data reveals is that for much of the 16th and 17th centuries, a very large proportion of European long-distance trade, grain from Poland and the Baltic, timber and naval stores from Scandinavia, fish from Newfoundland, Baltic herring, iron from Sweden, passed through the Sound, and Denmark taxed all of it. This was not a small income. At its height, the Sound toll accounted for as much as 2/3 of the Danish crown's total revenue. Denmark was, in economic terms, not so much a kingdom as a toll booth on the highway of European commerce. But the Kalmar Union itself was more troubled than its impressive geography suggested. The problem was structural. The 3 kingdoms had different laws, different social structures, different interests, and different relationships with the German Hanseatic League that dominated Baltic trade. Danish attempts to govern the Union as a centralized entity, with Denmark clearly in the dominant position, generated persistent Swedish resistance. The Union stuttered through the 15th century in a series of crises, revolts, and renegotiations. Swedish noblemen repeatedly revolted against Danish rule. Danish kings repeatedly suppressed the revolts with varying degrees of success and brutality. The Union's nominal unity concealed a fundamental tension that would eventually tear it apart. The moment of final rupture came in November 1520. In an event so shocking that it still carries a distinctive name in Scandinavian history: the Stockholm Bloodbath. King Christian II of Denmark, having finally suppressed the latest Swedish rebellion, convened a great reconciliation ceremony in Stockholm, and then arrested and executed approximately 90 of the leading Swedish bishops, nobles, and burghers who had attended in good faith. The executions were carried out over 3 days. The bodies were burned to prevent religious martyrdom. The Stockholm bloodbath destroyed whatever remained of the Kalmar Union's legitimacy. A Swedish nobleman named Gustav Vasa, whose father had been among the dead in Stockholm, launched a rebellion that expelled the Danish forces and established Sweden as an independent kingdom in 1523. The Kalmar Union was over. For Denmark, this was a significant setback. For Sweden, it was the beginning of a remarkable century of expansion. And for the next 150 years, the relationship between Denmark and Sweden would be defined by a series of devastating wars that would reshape the map of Scandinavia and reduce Denmark from a regional superpower to a medium-sized kingdom scrambling to preserve what it had. The 16th century was, by any measure, the most dangerous century in Danish history. Within the space of 50 years, Denmark lost the Kalmar Union, fought multiple ruinous wars with Sweden, experienced a violent religious revolution that tore the country apart, and found its sound toll revenues threatened by the emergence of new Atlantic trade routes that began to bypass the Baltic altogether. It should, by any reasonable historical logic, have destroyed the kingdom. It did not. And the reason it did not is that Denmark, faced with an existential crisis, chose adaptation with a thoroughness that would define its character for centuries. The Lutheran Reformation arrived in Denmark in the late 1520s and transformed the kingdom with a comprehensiveness that is still visible today. Christian III, who came to the throne after a brutal civil war called the Count's Feud that tore Denmark apart between 1534 and 1536, introduced Lutheranism as the official state religion of Denmark in 1536, dissolved the monasteries, confiscated the enormous wealth of the Catholic Church, and reorganized the entire ecclesiastical structure of the kingdom. The Church's wealth was not, in Denmark as in England, simply distributed to courtiers and favorites. A significant portion of it was used to fund the expansion of the state apparatus, schools, hospitals, poor relief, and the administrative infrastructure of a Protestant kingdom that took its social responsibilities seriously. The Reformation in Denmark was, in a very real sense, the beginning of the Danish welfare state, the moment when the social functions that the Church had performed were taken over by the Crown and administered through state institutions. This is a profoundly important moment in Danish history that is insufficiently appreciated outside Scandinavia. The Lutheran Reformation in Denmark was not simply a theological revolution. It was a transfer of social responsibility from religious to civil authority that established patterns of state engagement with social welfare that persisted through the Enlightenment, through the 19th century liberal reforms, and into the comprehensive welfare state of the 20th century. The institutional memory of the 1536 Reformation is still visible in the Danish state's approach to social provision 4.5 centuries later. The wars with Sweden that dominated the 17th century were Denmark's severest test. Between 1611 and 1658, Denmark and Sweden fought 4 major wars, and Denmark lost all of them to a degree that progressively stripped away the territorial possessions that had made it a great power. The most devastating was the Roskilde Peace of 1658, when the settlement that ended the Second Northern War, a conflict in which the Swedish king, Charles X Gustav, marched an army across the frozen strait between Jutland and the Danish islands in the middle of winter, an event still almost unbelievable to people who know how deep and unpredictable those waters are in February, and forced Denmark to accept peace terms that stripped it of its eastern possessions, Scania, Blekinge, and Halland, the provinces that had been Danish for centuries and that, with Sweden, had formed the Sound itself. Denmark lost control of both sides of its own most important waterway. The territory lost in 1658 was enormous, roughly a third of Denmark's total land area, and the loss was permanent. Those provinces are still Swedish today. The border between Denmark and Sweden runs roughly where the Roskilde Peace placed it. This was catastrophic, and yet, here is what Denmark did next, and why it matters. Faced with the loss of its Swedish territories, Denmark did not collapse into civil war, did not replace one dynasty with another, did not fragment into smaller principalities as comparable German territories had done. Instead, under King Frederick III, Denmark in 1660 underwent a constitutional revolution from an elective monarchy controlled by the nobility to a hereditary absolute monarchy that concentrated power in the crown and allowed the state to reorganize itself efficiently. The hereditary royal law of 1665 codified this arrangement. It was one of the most comprehensive documents of royal absolutism in European history, but it was also, crucially, a law. The Danish monarch's absolute power was defined and bounded by a written text. This is different from the English Stuart king's assertion of divine right, which was a claim that the monarch was above the law. The Danish absolute monarchy was an absolute power defined by law, which is a subtly but importantly different arrangement. Denmark then used its concentrated royal authority to rebuild. The sound toll continued to generate revenue. A mercantilist commercial policy, trading companies, colonial ventures, the development of Copenhagen as a major commercial center, sought to compensate for the lost territorial revenues. The army was reformed. The state bureaucracy was professionalized. Denmark retreated from its ambitions as a major power and focused on being an effective, well-governed, commercially prosperous, medium-sized kingdom. It had been forced by disaster to find its actual scale, and in doing so, it found something more durable than imperial ambition. The 18th century transformed Denmark in ways that the Viking Age never could have anticipated. The absolute monarchy that had been established by Frederick III proved, under his successors, to be a system capable of extraordinary reform, when the monarch choosing to implement that reform had the intelligence and will to do so. And in the late 18th century, Denmark produced one of the most radical sequences of reform in European history. The most surprising chapter in this story involves a German physician, a mentally unstable king, a love affair, and a brief period in which Denmark became the most enlightened state in Europe. Johann Friedrich Struensee was a German-born physician who became the personal doctor of King Christian VII of Denmark, a king who was, by all available evidence, severely mentally ill, possibly suffering from schizophrenia or a related condition, and was entirely incapable of governing. Struensee's influence over Christian grew to such a degree that by 1770 he was effectively the regent of Denmark, issuing royal decrees in the king's name and implementing a program of Enlightenment reforms that transformed Danish society with extraordinary speed. In 18 months, Struensee and his allies abolished torture, introduced freedom of the press, eliminated censorship, reformed the judicial system, curbed the power of the court aristocracy, and began the process of freeing Denmark's serfs. He also, not unrelatedly, too became the lover of the Danish queen, Caroline Mathilde, sister of the British King George III, which added a layer of personal drama to the political drama that the Danish aristocracy found quite sufficient grounds for action. The coup against Struensee in January 1772 removed him, imprisoned the queen, and ended his personal power. He was executed in April of that year in a manner designed to be maximally humiliating. But his reforms were not entirely reversed. Some of the most important survived his fall, establishing precedents that the Danish Enlightenment continued to build on. The single most important Danish reform of the 18th century came in 1788, the abolition of inscription, the feudal system that had bound Danish peasants to their lord's land since the medieval period. This is Denmark's equivalent of the Emancipation Proclamation, the moment when the fundamental social arrangement of the agricultural economy was transformed, and millions of Danish farmers became free people who could move, own property, and make independent economic decisions for the first time. The 1788 reform was not the end of rural poverty or inequality, but it was the beginning of the transformation of Danish agriculture that would, by the late 19th century, produce the cooperative farming movement, the folk high schools, and the specifically Danish model of rural development that has been studied and admired around the world ever since. Denmark's path to democracy was relatively gentle by European standards, which is not to say it was without conflict, but rather that the specific violence of revolution was largely avoided. The Constitution of 1849, adopted following a period of popular pressure and political negotiation rather than a bloody uprising, established Denmark as a constitutional monarchy with a free parliament, a free press, and civil rights for its citizens. The old absolute monarchy was replaced not by revolution, but by negotiation. This capacity for negotiated change, for adapting to new political realities without the catastrophic violence that revolutionary change typically produces, is one of the defining characteristics of Danish political culture. It runs from the 1660 Constitutional Revolution through the 1788 Peasant Reforms to the 1849 Constitution to the peaceful transition to full parliamentary democracy in the early 20th century. Denmark learned during its medieval and early modern crises that institutions matter more than any specific configuration of power, and that the ability to adapt those institutions without destroying them is the key to political survival. It is a lesson the country has taken seriously ever since. The 19th century began catastrophically for Denmark. The Napoleonic Wars, the great earthquake of early modern European history, hit Denmark with a force that no previous crisis had matched. Denmark tried to stay neutral. Napoleon would not permit it. Britain would not permit it. In 1801, the British fleet attacked Copenhagen harbor, destroying the Danish fleet in a preemptive strike to prevent Napoleon from using it. The British attacked again, more devastatingly, in 1807, bombarding Copenhagen for 3 days, killing approximately 2,000 civilians and seizing the entire Danish fleet. In response, Denmark aligned with Napoleon, a decision that proved disastrous. When Napoleon fell in 1814, Denmark was on the losing side. The Peace of Kiel required Denmark to cede Norway to Sweden, the loss of a kingdom that had been in personal union with Denmark since 1380. The loss of Norway, following the loss of the Swedish provinces in 1658, left Denmark a genuinely small country, reduced in territory, in population, and in economic weight, to a fraction of what it had been at the height of Cnut's empire or even the Sound Toll era. And then, in 1864, it got worse. Prussia and Austria jointly invaded and defeated Denmark, stripping away the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein, approximately 1/3 of Denmark's remaining territory, including a substantial portion of Jutland. Denmark lost 40% of its land and nearly 1/3 of its population. At this point, any reasonable geopolitical analysis would have concluded that the Kingdom of Denmark was in terminal decline. A small, twice-humiliated northern European country that had lost its empire, its ally, its navy, and 1/3 of its territory within 50 years. Instead, something remarkable happened. Denmark turned inward and built. The political and cultural revolution of the late 19th century is the foundation of modern Denmark. Several strands of development converged to produce the country that the 20th century would recognize. First, the cooperative movement. Danish farmers, responding to the crisis created by cheap American grain imports that devastated the grain market in the 1870s and 1880s, reorganized their agricultural operations around cooperative ownership. The dairy cooperative, the slaughterhouse cooperative, the supply cooperative. These institutional innovations allowed small Danish farms to compete with industrial agriculture by sharing the costs of processing, marketing, and supply. Danish butter, Danish bacon, and Danish cheese found markets across Europe and particularly in Britain. Agricultural exports rebuilt the Danish economy and created the prosperous rural middle class that would become the social foundation of Danish democracy. Second, the folk high school movement. Inspired by the philosopher and poet N.F.S. Grundtvig, Denmark built a network of non-examination-based educational institutions, the Folkehøjskoler, that provided adult education to the rural population. These schools taught not examination subjects, but practical skills, civic awareness, Danish history and culture, and the ability to participate intelligently in a democratic society. The folk high schools are one of the most successful educational experiments in modern history, and they are specifically Danish, an institution that presupposes that education should serve the life of the community, not merely the career of the individual. Third, the political reforms that completed the transition to full parliamentary democracy in 1901 and, in 1915, extended the vote to women and servants, making Denmark one of the early democracies to implement universal suffrage. The 20th century tested Danish survival instincts again. A German occupation between 1940 and 1945 placed Denmark in the position of all occupied countries, the impossible calculation of collaboration, resistance, and survival. Denmark's record is complex and has been vigorously debated by Danish historians. The initial decision to maintain the existing government under German supervision, the later armed resistance, and the extraordinary moment in October 1943 when the Danish population collectively rescued approximately 7,000 of Denmark's 8,000 Jews by smuggling them to neutral Sweden in boats before the German deportation order could be implemented. The Danish rescue of the Jews is one of the genuine moral bright spots of the Second World War. It was not, the historical record shows, primarily the action of an organized resistance, but of ordinary Danish citizens, fishermen, neighbors, or colleagues, people who simply decided, when confronted with the immediate reality of what was happening to their neighbors, that they would not permit it. The rescue succeeded because of the collective action of thousands of individuals acting on the same moral intuition simultaneously. This moment is often cited as representative of something specifically Danish, a civic culture that values solidarity, that does not readily abandon members of the community to external threat, that places collective responsibility above individual risk aversion. Whether that characterization is entirely fair as a generalization, the event itself is historically real and historically remarkable. Post-war Denmark built, with remarkable speed and consistency, the welfare state that has made it one of the most studied political models in the world. My universal health care, universal pension, free university education, comprehensive unemployment insurance, active labor market policies that support both flexibility for employers and security for workers, the model that economists call flexicurity, a specifically Danish innovation in labor market organization. The Danish welfare state is not a luxury. It is, its architects argued, and its economists have generally confirmed, an economic efficiency, a system that reduces the friction costs of insecurity, that allows labor to move to more productive uses without the catastrophic personal consequences that insecurity otherwise prevents, and that produces a healthier, better educated, more socially trusting population that is more economically productive as a result. It is also, by international comparison, extraordinarily successful. Denmark consistently scores among the highest in the world on measures of happiness, trust, social mobility, life satisfaction, and democratic participation. Corruption is minimal. Inequality, while not absent, is substantially lower than in comparable developed economies. Civil society is rich and participatory. How did a Viking tribe become the world's happiest people? The answer lies in everything this story has covered. The Iron Age hardiness that survived the bog and the sea, The Viking organizational genius that built ships and states simultaneously. The medieval political learning that established institutional solutions to the problems that blood and force could not solve. The Reformation transfer of social responsibility from church to state. The 18th century Enlightenment reforms that made Denmark early to abolish serfdom and late to cling to feudalism. The 19th century cooperative revolution that made the small scale economically viable. The 20th century welfare state that converted the gains of democratic governance into the daily lived experience of security. None of these developments was inevitable. All of them were the result of human choices. Sometimes the choices of extraordinary individuals like Harald Bluetooth or Margaret I or NFS Grundtvig, but more often the accumulated choices of ordinary people responding to the specific pressures of their specific moment with the resources that their particular inheritance had given them. Denmark is the world's oldest continuous monarchy. The royal line that Harald Bluetooth established in the 10th century still sits on the Danish throne today, in the person of King Frederick X, who ascended in January 2024. 1,400 years of a single royal line through plague and invasion and defeat and revolution. That is not luck. That is institutional design, political culture, and the specific combination of pragmatism and idealism that the Danish experience seems over and over to produce. The Tollund man lies in a museum in Silkeborg, Denmark, the Iron Age face still as calm and as present as the day the peat farmers found him. Tourists travel from around the world to see him. He looks as though he might be sleeping. He has been there for 2,400 years, in the dark, patient, outlasting everything. Empires, religions, languages, technologies, political systems that seemed immovable when they were built and that are now archaeological layers. And the land he lies in is still there, changed almost beyond recognition in its surface forms, but geographically identical, still surrounded by the same cold seas, still shaped by the same winter light, still Denmark. The tiny Viking tribe built well. Thank you for watching, boring history lovers. If this sparked something, subscribe. We have the full history of every civilization that shaped the world you live in, waiting for you. Sources for everything in this video are pinned in the comments.